Here is Sailor Studio 680, and I see this described online as a medium brown. Now, there's nothing medium about this brown. It is just as dark as I had expected by looking at the swatch, which really just goes to show that there's a need to look at many different reviewers of a product. We can have wildly different experiences with it, but I can only ever speak on the sample that I have. Now, across every pen, this maintained being a very dark brown, though it is darker on some papers. Not a huge shading ink because I think of how dark it is, but it still manages to offer some shading. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it looks a bit darker and it still shades, but it is aggressive against those papers, getting deeper into the paper. I can say that while this isn't my favorite brown, I love using it and could really get some great use out of a bottle or three if I had it.
The pen for today is a Platinum 3776. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
The tone we're getting on this page is a nice dark brown that does not feather, does not spread, does have some shading, therefore it's pretty easy to find. When you look at therefore on the second line, I think this shows it some of the least, which you can still see it where the T is slightly lighter than the H, E, E. The R lightens up a little bit. The E, F darkens some more through the first half of the O. R getting a bit lighter, and the E at the end, darker again. Where if you wanted it to stand out a little bit better and be able to see it, you look at integer, where the in is nice and mid-tone. The teger at the end does get dark and solid. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Kobe number 54. Here is Sailor Oregon. Here is Sailor Studio 273. Here is Sailor Studio 143.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
The tone we're getting here is just the tiniest bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does have some shading, though not as standout as it is on the Clairfontaine. You can find areas where it's shading quite nice, like find on the third line, where the F-I-N, not the end, not fin, but the fin is a little bit lighter than that D at the end. So on the same line is generally a lighter tone and looks very nice. Looking at the back of the page and just wanting to make sure it shows on camera, there's a lot of places that it got very deep into the paper. I don't know that I would write front and back this ink on this paper for that reason. None of these spots bled through touching the page on the other side, and ghosting's not really an issue, just a little bit of over penetration.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone we're getting here on the page is lighter than we got on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade when, fortunately, we can spot it without any kind of real problem. Take a look at fortunately on the first line, where the F is darker than the or between the F and T. The T darkens up a bit into the I, but the intentionally is mostly a lighter tone until you get to the ly at the end. It's worth noting that there's really no tone variation, I think, because of the tone of the paper. I believe it's because of the makeup of the paper, meaning I think what we have here is a bit more opaque and ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, making this a good paper for this ink.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade just as well as the Clairfontaine, but not to as dark a tone as the Clairfontaine. So it still goes from a nice darker mid-tone to a very dark, but the very dark here is not as dark as the very dark on the Clairfontaine. It stands out against the quad rule with no problem, making this really good if you use quad rule paper all the time. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more brown inks. Here is Ackerman SBRE Brown.
Here is Aurora Sepia.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company Honus Wagner Infield Brown. Here is KWZ Brown No. 2. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is ever so slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, though not coming through as flatter, which is frequently what happens on this paper. It often eats up a little bit of the interest of that ink. No feather, no spread, still shades just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. Stands out against the quad rule with no problem, making this a great ink for a student to use. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Ackerman, their No. 20. Here is Diamine Evergreen. Here is Robert Oster Orange.
Here is Twisby Blue Black.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
The tone we're getting here is noticeably lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather. I'm going to say it does not spread, which is not common when it comes to the copy paper, but this ink is doing a great job. It still shades, not as standout as on some of the premium stuff, but still shades incredibly well, considering what we're writing on. Good ink if this is the paper you frequently use. Looking at the back of the page, we do see some spots that it gets slightly deeper. I'm going to let all of that go because largely what we're seeing is minimal ghosting, no bleed through. This is a great ink to use if you regularly write on this because you could probably write on both sides with no problem.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The soft fine nib of the Platinum 3776 is a very dry nib, which usually results in the lightest tone of the ink. Off camera, I tried this in a wet fine, and it got generally darker and had no shading. Just gave us a very dark, beautiful brown with no shading throughout it. Now, I'm going to stay with the dry fine or even go for a dry stub. I think this is dark enough, and these options will keep the shading, even as subtle as it can be at times.